In 1788, the United States of America became a republic under a new constitution. The years leading up to this were years in which strife and upheaval, revolution, the dry rot of the Articles of Confederation, internal disputes and uprisings, and the watchful scorn of Britain and Spain had been heaped at America's feet, one on top of the other. But now, with a newly ratified plan of union, a strong centralized government, and the settlement of hostilities between the states, it seemed that the nation might be able to put trouble behind her, consolidate her strength, and enjoy at least an interlude of peaceful growth and prosperity. Unfortunately, this was not to be the case. Many grave problems loomed up to plague the new republic, some domestic, some foreign, some financial, but mostly political. George Washington was elected president in 1789. John Adams was vice president. Washington, a wealthy Virginia plantation owner, was the key figure in American politics from the beginning. Washington was a Federalist, a strong advocate of the centralized plan of government. During the 4 aimless years the nation floundered about under the Articles of Confederation, Washington had worked and waited for the revisions and the new beginning he believed had to come. From his home in Mount Vernon, he corresponded with other leaders, held meetings, and consistently urged representatives of all the states to gather together and begin the work of uniting the country in earnest. When this convention finally did take place and the new Constitution resulted, George Washington's name was the first to be signed to it. Following ratification of the Constitution, the College of Electors unanimously chose Washington to be the nation's first president. John Adams, another Federalist and longtime associate, served with him. Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City on April 30th, 1789. New York was at the time the capital of the United States. The day of Washington's inauguration was holiday in atmosphere. The people revered him. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to them that the man who had led them safely and triumphantly through their struggle for freedom should now be the one to lead them to peace and prosperity. Washington, who had sternly silenced his loyal troops at the war's end when they wished to make him King of America, was most reluctant to accept the presidency. He abhorred titles of any kind, and even the simple word president always made him uneasy. However, his country needed him once again, and Washington could not ignore that need. Here is the solemn oath he swore when he took office. The oath of office. Washington repeated these words as they were read to him. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. In those days, the Vice President did not take his oath of office in public. John Adams was inaugurated privately a short while later. The oath that Washington swore is the same as that which presidents use today. Following the administration of the oath of office, George Washington addressed a few words to the enthusiastic onlookers and went inside from the balcony to where the new representatives and senators were gathering to welcome him as their chief executive. Washington then made a speech to Congress. Since then, every president has made such a speech called the inaugural address. In this address, the president usually tells of his hopes and plans for the future of his administration, discusses the problems that must be overcome, and generally gives the country a good idea of what he expects to accomplish. Washington realized very well, as did every man who heard him, the vast difficulties that faced America on every hand. He was only too familiar with the undercurrent of partisan rivalry of the men he would have to deal with. He knew that the entire country clung by its fingertips to the edge of a vast and unexplored wilderness, full of unknown dangers and thickly populated with hostile Indians. When Washington took office, there were less than 4 million people in the 13 colonies. Most of them were farmers. 90% were of English, Scottish, and Irish descent. There was a large element of Germans. New York's Dutch descendants were still very much in evidence. Delaware had many Swedish settlers, and the two Carolinas were extensively populated by descendants of French Huguenots. But most of the population from Massachusetts to Georgia were English-speaking. Virginia was the largest state, Pennsylvania second, and North Carolina third. Most of the population was centered along a narrow strip by the coastline, but even along here, there were large stretches of wilderness, forests, swamps, and Indian lands. Only a scant few thousand pioneers had so far crossed the Allegheny Mountains into Kentucky and Tennessee. Philadelphia was the largest city with a population of about 42,000. There were very few other real cities except for Boston and New York. The present cities of Utica, Binghamton, and Pittsburgh were nothing more than forts along the frontier, and all through the Northwest were scattered forts and trading posts belonging to the English, who had so far refused to honor their obligations under the Treaty of Paris by removing them. It is no wonder that Washington had some misgivings about becoming the nation's first chief executive. He had heavy responsibilities facing him. The new plan of government, for all its obvious virtues, was just that, a plan, a blueprint, existing only on paper. Would it work? Could George Washington or anyone make it work? Knowing full well that it was up to him to make it work, Washington deliberately ignored differing political philosophies among the men he knew and selected his advisors on the basis of their abilities and statesmanship. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson Secretary of State to deal with foreign affairs. Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, farmer, musician, teacher, inventor, governor of Virginia, congressman, minister to France, was full of faith in the destiny of man and staunch in his belief that all men, if given the opportunity, could rule themselves ably. He was, a few years later, to become our third president and one of our most memorable. One of Jefferson's leading rivals was Alexander Hamilton, a close friend and protege of Washington. Washington understood the antipathy between the two, but would not sacrifice the peace of the nation for peace and quiet in the cabinet. Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury to find ways of raising money for the new government. He came to the attention of the popular leaders of the colonies by writing a series of brilliant papers defending the colonists for their actions against the British. In 1782, he represented New York in Congress, and from there on, he worked towards establishing a new, strong federal government. He conceived and wrote much of the material in a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, arguing for adoption of the new Constitution. As Secretary of the Treasury, his was one of the most difficult offices of government to lead at that time. But he had the confidence of Washington and John Adams, and temporarily at least, the goodwill of Thomas Jefferson. With Henry Knox, Edmund Randolph, and Samuel Osgood, the first cabinet was formed to advise the president. Knox, the Secretary of War, was one of the commissioners who had settled peace terms with Britain. Randolph, a former governor of Virginia, became the Attorney General. Samuel Osgood became Postmaster General. Washington then appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Immediately after his inauguration, Washington gathered these men about him and got down to the business of government. The first problem facing the nation was money, the lack of it. Where and how to raise it, how to spend it wisely. This was Alexander Hamilton's department, and Hamilton had several ideas. Hamilton suggested taxing goods imported from foreign countries to raise money. This was called a tariff. He also proposed to pay in full all of the government's foreign and domestic debts, assume the war debts of the states, which England kept reminding them about, and place an excise or internal revenue tax on whiskey. Hamilton's program caused a sharp division in the Congress. Opponents argued that payment of the debt in full would ruin the country. They said that assumption of state debts was unfair to states that had already partly paid their debts. However, despite criticism and bitter arguments, Hamilton won. His policies convinced the people that government bonds would be safe investments. Assumption of the war debts gave the financial classes in each state a stake in the new government's success. Business was stimulated. The tariff and the excise tax were not popular, but they did provide a steady income. And then suddenly, The authority of the new government was dramatically challenged. Riots broke out when attempts were made to collect the whiskey tax proposed by Hamilton. Due to transportation difficulties, farmers in western Pennsylvania could only send their grain produce to market in the form of whiskey. They felt that since they had no choice but to do so or lose their crop, the federal tax law on whiskey was prejudicial to them. They tarred and feathered tax agents who tried to collect it. Washington sent soldiers to put down the rebellion. It was realized that the new government could and would enforce laws. Under Governor Henry Lee of Virginia, 15,000 militiamen quelled the uprising. The leaders fled the country. This was the first instance where the constitutional precept of ensuring domestic tranquility was put to the test. The government's success in the Whiskey Rebellion won the people's respect and established a precedent for proper procedure in years to come. Meanwhile, an issue arose which was to bring an open split between opposing factors in the government, to give rise to a new political party, and was to remain a bone of contention up through Andrew Jackson's administration. Hamilton had Congress provide for a United States bank to help the government collect and pay out money. This plan was violently opposed by many, but Congress approved it, and in 1791, Hamilton set up the Bank of the United States and a national mint for the making of coins. The government subscribed to 1/5 of the bank's capital. It deposited its money with the bank and used it as the agent in floating loans. The bank's notes were used as currency. By increasing the amount of sound money in circulation, they gave a big boost to business. The Bank of the United States brought the moneyed classes, the property owners, and businessmen closer together with the government. However, there was a growing element of distrust in the government among the farmers, unskilled laborers, and small businessmen. They began to listen to what Thomas Jefferson had to say. Jefferson had been against the whiskey tax from the beginning. He argued that most of Hamilton's laws favored the wealthy property owners at the expense of ordinary citizens. Hamilton's supporters were called Federalists. They had little faith in the ability of the common people to govern themselves. They believed that only those who were born into positions of wealth and property and who were highly educated understood the intricate processes of administration. John Adams, another fervent Federalist, was to become the next president. It was during the first real political campaign the United States had that the fierce infighting, political backbiting, and general mudslinging began between the Federalists and the followers of Thomas Jefferson. Washington himself was dismayed and saddened by the conflict. He, of course, was re-elected to the presidency, but everyone was well aware that the bitterness was only building up, ready to explode the minute his sure, strong hand was lifted from the taut reins of government. In the meantime, those who listened to Thomas Jefferson had formed neighborhood clubs called democratic societies. They held debates, gave lectures, and discussed the important questions of the day. They encouraged men of their beliefs to organize and support Republican candidates. Jefferson's supporters were called Democrat-Republicans. They opposed Hamilton's ideas. This was the start of political parties. Although Hamilton and the Federalists had been largely responsible for getting the Constitution adopted, Jefferson felt that they were now betraying it and that liberty was being destroyed. Jefferson wrote, "The American people are naturally divided into two parties, those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes, and two, those who identify themselves with the people, have confidence in them, and consider them as the most honest and most safe depository of the public interests. In every country where these two parties exist, and in every one where they are free to think, speak, and write, they will declare themselves." Washington refused a third term of office. He wanted to return to Mount Vernon. He left the presidency after delivering his farewell address, which contained some excellent advice. He condemned party politics and sectional strife. He urged friendship and trade with all nations, but he warned the country not to become involved in entangling alliances with foreign countries, which would mix America up in complicated European rivalries and disputes. Alexander Hamilton continued as leader of the Federalist Party, although he resigned his office. Jefferson's new party was not yet strong enough or well enough organized to overcome the Federalists in the next election. In the election of 1796, John Adams became our second president, with Jefferson as vice president. That was the odd way that elections were conducted in those days. The man with the most electoral votes became president, and whoever came in second automatically became vice president. Of course, eventually, this was amended. But in 1796, Adams, the Federalist, and Jefferson, the Democrat-Republican, who both loathed each other personally and politically, were very much stuck with each other for the time being. Jefferson could do little except keep out of the way and work at building the strength and influence of his own party for the next election. During Adams' administration, our national capital was moved to Washington, D.C. John Adams and his wife Abigail were the first presidential couple to live in the mansion which later on came to be called the White House. They arrived by coach to find the new capital in a sea of mud, raw new buildings sticking forlornly up here and there out of a flat, grassless tract of land. But Adams had little opportunity to contemplate landscaping problems. He was up to his ears in unpopularity due to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which the Federalists had pushed through Congress. These allowed the government to imprison and even deport naturalized citizens for speaking or writing criticism of the government. It was aimed directly at the opposition press. These extremely partisan acts were immediately denounced as tyrannical and unconstitutional. Eventually, they caused the downfall of both Adams and his party. From the beginning of his administration, Adams was also involved in a sticky international situation. In 1789, a revolution broke out in France. A war with Great Britain followed. The French Revolution opened the way for the establishment of a French Republic. But soon, French governmental control became centered about the extreme Jacobin party, and France became embroiled in a whole series of wars against European monarchies. The English king hoped to crush the French revolutionary government and restore the king to his throne. For a while, America was caught in a squeeze play for power between France and Britain. Britain ordered the seizure of American ships carrying trade goods to the French West Indies and from there to France. They also took American sailors off American ships and forced them to work on British ships, falsely claiming that they were deserters from the British Navy or rightfully belonged to England because they were of British descent. On the other hand, France went even a step further. France was angry because we did not help her in this war. She stopped our ships. At first, American sympathy had been with the French. In fact, many Democrat-Republicans wanted America to join France in her war with England. But Washington had been alarmed at the danger of another fight with England when America was just recovering from the Revolution. He had issued a proclamation calling for strict neutrality. This infuriated France, and during President Adams' administration, the United States was involved in an undeclared naval war with the French. The French knew that the Federalists supported the British, and they refused to accept the minister we sent to France. Then they began to sink American ships trading with the British. The Federalists seized upon this as a reason to attack France, saying the United States must take steps to defend its ships. Adams wanted to avoid war with France. He sent a committee to make terms with the French. But when the envoys got to France, they were greeted with demands for a bribe. This became known as the XYZ affair, from the symbols used for the French agents who asked for money. America was shocked and outraged upon hearing of this. Public opinion shifted abruptly against France. A new American slogan was created: millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Congress acted quickly and ended the Treaty of 1778 with France. It enlarged the American Army, ordered completion of several ships of war, and began arming merchant ships. Several naval battles took place, and American privateers captured many prizes. Then at the end of 1799, the current French government was overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, now head of France, agreed to a treaty and war was avoided. But meanwhile, the international difficulties had sharpened the rivalry between America's two political parties. Both totally ignored Washington's plea for an end to strife between them. During the naval war with France, each party had attacked the other in a public display of mudslinging that spared nobody, not even Washington. The Federalists published libelous slanders about the Democrat-Republicans, who quickly reciprocated in kind. Under the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Federalists in power used the new army to arrest crowds of angry citizens. Soldiers off duty were encouraged to raid and loot the homes of Democrat-Republicans and to smash the printing presses of liberal newspapers. Thomas Jefferson led the fight against the Alien and Sedition Acts, charging the Federalists with trying to destroy freedom of speech and of the press. He continued the fight during the bitter election campaign of 1800. Now let's see how well you remember. Here is a list of 6 statements, one of which is false. See if you can spot the false statement. 1. George Washington was elected as our first president in 1789. 2. Washington appointed a group of men to advise him. This group was the first cabinet. 3. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, had the task of raising money for the new government. 4. The Whiskey Rebellion brought about a government withdrawal of the excise tax on grain spirits. 5. Washington refused a 3rd term of office and was succeeded by John Adams. 6. Trouble broke out with France, but war was avoided by a treaty. Did you spot the false statement? Here are the true ones. Things to remember. 1. George Washington was elected as our first president in 1789. 2. Washington appointed a group of men to advise him. This group was the first cabinet. 3. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, had the task of raising money for the new government. 4. Washington refused a 3rd term of office and was succeeded by John Adams. 5. Trouble broke out with France, but war was avoided by a treaty. Number 4 in the first list was false. The Whiskey Rebellion brought about a government withdrawal of the excise tax on grain spirits is wrong. The Whiskey Rebellion was successfully put down by federal troops, which proved the ability of the new government to maintain peace and enforce laws is correct. It was a miracle that George Washington was able to hold in check the 2 opposing political forces which were so strongly represented in his own cabinet. But he knew what was coming when he stepped down from power, and it was only with a forlorn hope that he departed the presidency, asking that party friction be set aside in the interests of the nation. Despite the storm that America had come through, and the storm that lay just ahead, much that was solid and worthwhile had been accomplished during the first years under the Constitution.